Welcome back to the class. We are continuing our discussion on cultural globalization. In the previous class, we had a session on Huntington's thesis on clash of civilizations, and we had a brief look at how this particular work on clash of civilization became very influential, at the same time highly controversial during late 90s and early 2000, because Huntington projected a very gloomy picture about the world by firmly focusing on the whole cultural question as the central pillar around which the global conflicts and then battles and wars will rage in the coming future. So I am now in this particular class. I am shifting my attention to an essay written by Robert Antonio titled "The Cultural Construction of Neoliberal Globalization." And this essay is taken from this Globalization reader by George Ritzer, one of the textbooks prescribed for this particular course. So unlike the previous classes, I am not using the PowerPoint. Rather, I am sifting through the essay. I have highlighted some of the important parts of the essay, and we can discuss them. Okay, so except for this initial slide, I am not using PowerPoint. I feel it is an important exercise that we learn to read lengthy essays and then try to identify important points, and then develop that ability to read and comprehend original essays. So in the coming classes as well, we will have more number of such kind of discussions where the original essays by the scholars would be analyzed along with maybe a very few PowerPoints as a kind of tools to help us in our discussion. So this class we are looking at the cultural construction of neoliberal globalization, an essay by Robert Antonio. So this is the essay. It's a chapter 3 in Ritzer's Globalization reader. And why is that I decided to include this particular essay? Because this particular essay talks about a very influential journalist, American journalist Thomas Friedman, and his role or his version in which he celebrated globalization. And this is also important because he is celebrating, because he represents a very important trend during late 1990s or early 2000, where at least a section of influential thinkers and scholars believed that the globalization will bring in a completely different world, and the world is moving towards a completely different direction, and it will be beneficial for everybody. So Thomas Friedman really represents such kind of a figure, who was a popular writer, who has written several books, who was a very important commentator, who had very close personal relationship with a lot of important higher ups, important officials. So somebody who considers himself as an elite, somebody who considers himself as a very important influencer in the international circles. So Robert Antonio is analyzing Thomas Friedman's arguments about globalization, because Friedman is an unapologetic advocate of globalization. Okay, his book "The World is Flat" is supposed to be one of the most popular works that celebrates globalization. And he also celebrates globalization also because he is also a very strong advocate of neoliberal economic policy. So Robert Antonio wants to understand this combination of the neoliberal economic logic and this unfolding of globalization is something very interesting. Okay, because it's not only that globalization taking place, but globalization is taking place in the larger framework of neoliberal economic logic. And this neoliberal economic logic, or this neoliberal economic structure, is something very important. And this is a critical essay. Of course, Robert Antonio is highly critical of Friedman, but that is reserved towards the end of the essay. So almost 3/4 of the essay is reproducing what Thomas Friedman wants to say, and how he looks at society, how he looks at inequality, how he looks at the globalization bringing in a level playing field for everybody, and he reserves a series of his criticism, very scathing criticism against Thomas Friedman only towards the end of the essay. So I urge all of you to read this essay. It's a very important essay. So this is a very prominent sentence. Honey, I think the world is flat. That's how Thomas Friedman uses his in his book. So he's talking about globalization is a multi-sided process, but the most intense debates over it have stressed its connection to a new global political economic regime with a distinct American template, neoliberalism. Okay, so this term neoliberalism is a very important one, and I hope you have some background understanding about it. And this became extremely popular in the Western circle, especially in the American circle, after Ronald Reagan became a very important advocate of a neoliberal economic policy, and he was also heavily influenced by Margaret Thatcher in the UK. So these two leaders are closely associated with the rise of this neoliberalism in the modern era. Those who wanted less and lesser role for the state, who wanted a kind of complete freedom for the private enterprises, private capitalists or private corporates. So they believed in that kind of an economic logic. So neoliberals champion free market policy, deregulation and tax cuts. They seek to minimize health, education, welfare and other social spending, and they contend that limited government, free trade and global capitalism offer the only road to reduce poverty and increased prosperity. So this neoliberalism has been very strongly, vehemently criticized by a host of other scholars, especially scholars who have some ideological affinity towards the left position or towards a kind of a Marxian position, because in the logic of neoliberalism, the state withdraws from some of its traditional duties and then allows the market to play with a free hand. And these scholars would argue that the market will never be a kind of a market will never usher in a kind of a neutral space. It will always favor the mighty. It will always favor the more powerful, the rich, and there will be a systematic shift in the economic scenario where the poorer people will become more and more poor and the inequality will only increase. So this whole discussion is about, as I mentioned, it's about Thomas Friedman, and then we are trying to understand what is the cultural construction of neoliberalism through the works of Thomas Friedman. And another very important line of Thomas Friedman: America was and for now still is the world's greatest dream machine. Okay, so he's proposing the American model as the model for the rest of the world, and how it has to be very fiercely protected, and how America can become the model for the rest of the world. So reported widely in the US media, Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis announced triumphantly a hegemonic made in America global political economic regime and new unipolar world arising in the wake of the collapsing of Soviet bloc. So Fukuyama held that modern peoples can no longer imagine a practical alternative that would represent a fundamental improvement over our current order. So Fukuyama argues that the end of history has arrived, because there is nothing more to happen in the world, because the ultimate destination of the world would be that of a free, democratic, liberal society as represented by that of the US. And this became highly influential and also controversial, especially after the demise of the USSR or the communist bloc. So Friedman was heavily influenced by this particular argument. So this was also followed in reality by Clinton, the then American president, and followed by his chief economic advisor Joseph Stiglitz. And it's very interesting to see that Stiglitz was a very important supporter of globalization when he was the economic advisor to Clinton. Bill Clinton. But later, Stiglitz turned out to be one of the bitter critics of globalization. So those who are interested can always look up for his works and his arguments about why that he had to shift or change his position regarding globalization. The Clinton administration's domestic programs of neoliberal deregulation, privatization and securitization, he holds, constituted the core of their globalization policy, put forward by in the US dominated IMF and G8. Stiglitz asserts that the reigning idea was that what is good for Goldman Sachs or Wall Street is good for America and the world. It's a very very highly problematic argument. And these are the two books that Friedman became very famous for. One is this Lexus and the Olive Tree, published in 2000, and second, more important or more famous book is this The World is Flat, published in 2005. Then this rest of these discussions are all about how important and influential a figure Thomas Friedman is. Perry Anderson identified the Lexus and the Olive Tree as the most ambitious and intransient theorization of ultra-capitalism in a global order. So all these scholars have identified the ability of Thomas Friedman to put even the most complicated ideas in a very simple and very appealing language so that everybody, even ordinary people, can understand that. So that is the reason why Thomas Friedman became an extremely popular writer, because he was able to capture the imagination of ordinary people. So he doesn't write in very dry academic language, but he writes in very attractive language. Yeah. So next section, Mr. Friedman's Planet: Globalization's Emergent Consumer Stockholder Republic. We Americans are the apostles of the fast world, the enemies of tradition, the prophets of the free market, and the high priests of high tech. We want enlargement of both our values and our Pizza Huts. We want the world to follow our lead and become democratic capitalist with a website in every port, Pepsi on every lip, Microsoft Windows on every computer, and most of all, with everyone pumping their own gas. Friedman defines globalization as the unparalleled, inexorable integration of market, nation states and technologies, which enable individuals, corporations and nation states to reach around the world farther, faster, deeper and cheaper than ever before, and in a way that is enabling the world to reach into individuals, corporations and nation states further, faster, deeper and cheaper than ever before. So go through this definition. He's talking about the very intense integration of the globe, so that it becomes more flexible, it becomes faster, deeper, it kind of interconnects everybody with each other. So he begins his analysis, especially in the immediate context of this post-communism, communist globalism. Friedman holds that a shift from the Cold War system to the globalization system occurred by the year 2000. He claims that the capitalist new phase, Globalization 3.0, will be at least as momentous as the two earlier globalization waves. That is 300 years of European mercantilist expansion and 200 years of modern capitalist development. So for Friedman, he describes this as Globalization 3.0. So globalization 1.0, or the first wave of globalization according to him, was when the beginning of the mercantile colonialism, maybe around 1500 AD. And then later the second wave of globalization according to him would have started 200 years back, when with the rise of modern capitalist development. And Friedman argues that that globalization 3.0 began in 2000 with a new understanding. So he undertakes a historical analysis, and he believes that the tearing down of the Berlin Wall inspired forward-looking people everywhere to shrink political power's grip over social life. In liberal democracies, Friedman argues this meant cutting state regulations, social programs and redistribution. Stopping far short of declaring state's end, he holds that individual states and the nation-state system constitute a necessary infrastructure for capitalism that helps coordinate provision and defend globalization system. So Friedman argues that the fall of Berlin Wall also indicated the collapse of an all-powerful state which wanted to extend its control into the social and personal and private life of the people, because you know that the Soviet Union or the communist regimes, they were much more stronger, much more far-reaching than that of a kind of a democratic system or capitalist system. So Friedman wants a more limited role to the state, and the state, according to Friedman, must be a kind of a facilitator, an enabler for the capitalist system to function. So he's an unapologetic defender or advocate of extreme capitalism. Okay, he has no qualms about it, he has no confusion about it. Perhaps misleadingly, Friedman claims to be a technological determinist and not a historical determinist. The term historical determinism is coined by Karl Marx. So he's definitely not a Marxist intellectual. After communism, he holds 9 flatteners, okay, 9 mechanisms that ensures the world remains flat. That is Netscape's IPO, workflow software, open sourcing, outsourcing, offshoring, supply chaining, insourcing, informing and wireless innovations, forged a new flat world platform that greatly accelerates, intensifies and extends global capitalism. Friedman sees this electronic connective tissue to be enabling mechanism for realizing the potential of the unparalleled opening, deregulating and privatizing of the economy that drove the move to Globalization 3.0. So Friedman understands this era around 2000 as a historical era in which a host of political as well as technological factors combinedly together, okay, paves open way for a completely different historical epoch which facilitates the unbridled expansion of capitalism. Okay, so he says that the era in which we are living, it is an era of capitalism and there is no structural or ideological obstructions for capitalism. Now, Darwinian-like selection compels serious players to remove more and more serious frictions. Yeah, so he's talking about how this particular neoliberal economy that will surge ahead by eliminating everything that tries to stop it, and the most efficient, the most energetic, the categories and the players with the highest amount of wealth, they will really succeed. So Darwinian-like selection compels serious players to remove more and more serious frictions or regulatory, redistributive and other social blockages that limit capitalist property rights and exchange. Friedman and his respondents imply that the consequent flat playing field is the heart of a knowledge-based economy with nearly frictionless transactional capitalist intercourse and drastically reduced transaction cost. So Friedman thinks that a completely frictionless free world will emerge, which will work as a kind of a level playing field for the capitalist players. And in a level playing capitalist field without any barriers for its development, capitalism will endorse better and better competition, it will become more and more efficient, and ultimately it will do a lot of goods for everyone. He also talks about fluid networks. This is a very, very interesting argument, because we will come back to this point of networks later. So, breaking radically from Cold War systems' fraudulent structures, Friedman argues today's globalization is a dynamic, ongoing process. So, in this section, Friedman is focusing on the very structure of enterprises, very structure of capitalist enterprises, and he's saying that the age-old, very rigid and bureaucratic structure is being completely replaced, okay, by a significantly different mechanism. So he doesn't agree with this idea of neo-Fordism or other kind of terminologies. What is something new about it, according to him? Friedman portrays a dawning post-bureaucratic era in which new technologies forge lateral collaboration rather than hierarchical control. Because we know bureaucracy is always understood as hierarchical. So Friedman argues that in the new era, in this globalization 3.0, it will be, instead of this vertical structure, it will be more lateral or horizontal collaboration. He claims that the new flat world supplants rigid, coercive, vertical organization with flexible, voluntary organization networks. Lateral communications and collaborations replace the mechanical obedience demanded by hierarchical line authority and constructive roles, jurisdictions and offices, and multitudinous individual decisions and initiatives established systems, non-linear patterns of association. So he's talking about a very radically different organizational structure which will facilitate more fluid organizational arrangement, better decision making, more collaborative decision making, less hierarchical and less bureaucratic. Friedman holds the Globalization 3.0's unique character derives from the newfound power of individuals to collaborate and compete globally, and that globalization is increasingly driven by the individuals. Okay, so he identifies the individual, maybe the global elites, the global nomads that we are going to discuss now. Friedman reposes a lot of faith to these people. So Friedman implies that the nomadic qualities are necessary for everyone navigating globalization 3.0. So he's saying that globalization requires a set of qualities for the new individuals in a globalized era. Okay, so they have to be nomads, they have to have a lot of cosmopolitan values, and they can't be the kind of old traditional blue collar workers, okay, whom you are familiar with. Stretching from Nietzsche to postmodern thinkers, cultural theorists have long predicted the arrival of the postmodern subject. Okay, not the modern subject who has said goodbye to tradition and became more progressive and more, somebody who uses rationality quite a lot. It's not that. A postmodern subject is this post-traditional individual usually is described as many-sided, hybrid nomad, uprooted from fixed space, multi-perspectival in purview, at home with otherness, and thus free to create his or her own values, identities and cultural forms. Okay, so one of the fundamental qualities of this postmodern subject is that they are kind of uprooted from any sort of cultural fixity. Okay, they are much more at ease in adapting to other ideas, adapting to other values. They have a, they enjoy a bouquet of values. They are quite comfortable with otherness. They are more adaptable, and they are multi-perspectival in a purview, at home with otherness. So a completely different set of individuals. Okay, so he argues that the players must be ready to move to new positions in an instant. Lifetime job security and long-term social contracts between firms and employees ended with globalization 2.0. This is another very startling argument that Friedman argues, puts forward. He would say that the whole idea of you having a permanent job or you having a long-term contract with a firm, that era is over. Now you might work for a short period in time for a company, and after that is over, you are ought to move on. The company will hire somebody else. You need to look for other things. So this is the kind of idea that he has about the notions of permanency and then stability and other things. Friedman and his respondents see flexible labor laws allowing untrammeled hiring and firing with maximal speed and minimal cost to be the essential to the flat world's open competition and voluntary integration. So his emphasis is heavily on the whole question of labor laws. And you know that labor laws have been one of the most contentious issues. The whole trade unions, especially left trade unions or every trade union for that matter, they have been historically campaigning, they have been fighting for more stringent labor laws that will protect the interest of the workers. Okay, that means you can't simply dismiss or fire workers. It's a more elaborate process. Workers' security is something important. And Friedman and a host of other advocates of neoliberalism is completely against that. They argue that this strong labor laws will only it will only stifle the capitalist system. It will work against the interests of the capitalists. So they want a free hand to the companies to hire and fire as they wish, which is actually happening even in India. If you look into some of the recent developments, labor laws are becoming more and more loose, more and more less effective, giving more more right and authority to the companies into this whole question of hiring and firing. He quotes an Asian business writer's portrayal of globalization's techno-capitalist postmodern subjects, or ZIPPs, belong to the generation Z. Can be male or female, studying or working, oozes attitude, ambition and aspiration, cool, confident and creative, seeks challenges, loves risks and shuns fear. Friedman adds that they are guilt-free about making money or spending it. Okay, so these new nomadic subjects, they have absolutely no guilt about making as much money and spending as much money. A completely different set of values. So unlimited consumer freedom and pleasure is the unspoken presupposition and chief virtue of golden straitjacket and its irreversible post-political globalized world. His postmodern nomads constitute their dynamic, largely deterritorialized, plural subjectivities by consuming global commodities as well as by multitasking and telecommuting. So this is his idea about this new global nomads who are quite adaptive, who consume a lot, who spend a lot, who are absolutely have no guilt about making more money and then maybe spending it. Another very important argument of Friedman is that he supports that inequality is bound to happen, and he argues that some kind of inequality is even better. So he has an argument about the legitimate form of inequality. Okay, he doesn't believe that you need to work, you need to strive towards an egalitarian society. He would simply brush aside all these things are utopian ideas. And on the other hand, he would argue that every society will be unequal and there is some kind of inequality is actually rather welcome. His idea of flatness implies a nascent just meritocracy based on ample opportunities in a worldwide free market. Friedman holds that the globalization system generates so much wealth and nearly everyone benefits. Even if inequality grows sharper, the ever larger basket of commodities available to consumers means that the process is not a zero-sum game. So his argument is that in this globalization 3.0, the overall wealth will increase. Okay, so that you will have some people who amass the vast majority of this wealth, but since the overall wealth increases, then everybody will be able to take their own share from it. Okay, and this is far better than more conservative kind of thing where the overall amount of wealth is much lower. He acknowledges that extreme inequalities and misery exist outside the flat world. That is, poor nations and even unskilled, non-wired sectors of wealthy nations, and admits that flat world growth will not often soften all inequalities or eliminate all poverty. However, Friedman holds that hope for a better life rides on joining the globalization system and benefits from its technological transfer, free trade and market-based growth. So he believes that this particular kind of an arrangement will ultimately benefit everyone. Another section is ownership, society and stakeholder direct democracy. Friedman prescribes a four-faceted democratization. So he says that with this arrival of globalization 3.0, democratization is happening at least in the four important domains. One is democratization of technology. As we know that important technologies have been democratized to a large extent, whether it is internet connection or computers or software, these things have become affordable to everybody. So nobody, according to Friedman, nobody is completely out of that. There is a larger democratization or distribution of technology. Then democratization of finance. Okay, ended insurance companies or investment banks and commercial banks monopoly control over financial transaction and provided inexpensive, easy access to credit and means to investment. And he believes so, that there is a democratization of finance. Then he is talking about democratization of information, which is again very important. Okay, now if you have quite a lot of information on your fingertips, you can Google it. So there is a major there's a significant availability of information of all kind. Then the fourth one he says is the democratization of decision making and the deconcentration of power and deconcentration of power and information. The democratization in terms of governance and then political power. So these conditions Friedman argues have brought in a kind of a completely different set of institutional frameworks, different set of social structures that would open up a kind of a free world, in his world, in his argument, a kind of a flat world, okay, where competition is the most important mechanism, and people have all facility, they are equally poised to compete with each other. Then he also argues for self-regulation, because in a global society, in a capitalist society, the role of the state must be limited. The state government or the state as a political system must withdraw from quite a lot of important domains and allow private players to compete with each other. Okay, and he argues that such a system will improve self-regulations. Okay, the corporate financial corporations and these capitalist players, they will devise very important mechanisms for their own self-regulation. No kind of regulation from the state is required. Then he also acknowledges, Friedman also acknowledges the kind of a backlash that can create from such a kind of a situation. So Friedman also mentions 20th century economist Joseph Schumpeter's argument, inspired in part by Marx, that the creative destruction, that the capitalism always has its own mechanism of destructing its own ways of doing things, so that it moves to the next level. So the destruction is not to destroy the whole system, but to increase its efficiency and productivity to a higher level. So he holds that Marx and Schumpeter's points about capitalists exceptionally powerful, restless, creative, productive forces, and ever more extensive markets constantly making obsolescent its own products, creating new ones, and transforming the wider cultural patterns more to today's third world globalization than globalization 2.0. Friedman's repeated reference to the falling walls and flatness imply that barriers to capitalism are being smashed more rapidly and completely than ever before. He suggests that the tension between capitalism and tradition is manageable within the flat world, and that it even produces laudable hybridity. So he is somebody who would argue that even though this capitalism will raise certain kind of challenges, it might create certain kind of problems, you always will be able to overcome them. Friedman implies that globalization 3.0's political and cultural enemies pose much more dangerous threat than violators motivated by personal economic gain. Holding that anti-globalization movement exploits capitalism tension with tradition, he argues that it is a reactionary backlash by people lacking the discipline, courage, energy, imagination and skill to adjust to post-Cold War realities. So he would label anybody who opposes this neoliberal policies or neoliberal globalization as people who do not have sufficient capacity to compete with others. Okay, so anybody who criticizes this particular worldview are seen as people having insufficient, or they are ineffective in terms of competing in this new world. And he argues that globalizations lead society and its quiet crisis. Friedman has moderated recently his earlier triumphant declaration that globalization is Americanization, and he no longer refers to Americanization globalization, because earlier he was very vehement in his argument that globalization is nothing but it's another form of Americanization. And as we have seen in the case of Samuel Huntington, Friedman also is of the argument that America must give the leadership role, or America must be the world leader in terms of providing or presenting itself as a model for the rest of the world. In this view, the United States is the globe's flattest spot. Okay, it has the best regulated, most efficient capital market, most transparent firms, strongest protection for private property rights, best designed tax and regulatory laws, most creative entrepreneurial culture, most flexible labor laws, largest consumer markets, best political system, and most open society. Now, maybe it's a time that we now kind of reflect the kind of a current scenarios, the kind of a current debates and crisis that America is facing today, while we look at Friedman's arguments now, the kind of situations like that gave rise to a president like Donald Trump, the internal difficulties and large-scale unemployment that is threatening American society. So all these things emerge as very grim reminders to Friedman's over-optimistic account of the globalization. Friedman asserts that I am now telling my own daughters, girls, finish your homework. People in China and India are starving for your jobs. Written in 2005. We know that this fear has kind of come true. China has emerged as a major competitor to the US, and India also had made significant progress in terms of in certain areas like software and other things. So he also argues about a unipolar geopolitics. He argues that the multipolar world system is over. You no longer will have more than one superpower, and there will be only one superpower, that is America. Russia is gone. China is just an emerging thing. So America, he believed that, or he strongly argued that America will remain as the most powerful, so that this whole system will be a kind of a unipolar world. Now, this section, Modernization Theory Redux, Electronic Social Darwinism, this is the section in which the author is providing a scathing critique of Friedman's position. So far he was only trying to summarize Friedman's argument. Now he is providing a very important critique of Friedman's position. So why is this particular title interesting? Modernization Theory Redux, Electronic Social Darwinism. So I hope you have some idea about modernization theory. Maybe in the week after this, next week, we will have some time discussing what is modernization and what is modernity. But modernization theory is a very powerful theory which was heavily influenced by sociology. The modern European countries, they had all these cultural and social and economic qualities to progress further, okay, at much faster pace compared to a host of countries who did not have these qualities. So modernization theory also believes that a singular model of growth, okay, or unilinear evolutionary model is what is meant for all societies. Or in other words, modernization theory argues that every society will have to follow the developmental path of the Western European societies, okay, characterized by increasing consumption, increasing industrialization, increasing per capita income, and so one model fit for all was the kind of modernization argument. And electronic social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is very controversial positions adopted by some of the founding fathers of sociology, especially Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin and his idea about social evolution. But even before Darwin's thesis was very popular, Spencer coined this whole idea about struggle for existence and survival of the fittest. So he put forward this argument that just like in the animal kingdom, okay, just like in the animal kingdom the fittest survive, in society also, among societies also, only the fittest societies will survive. Okay, other societies will simply disappear. So this became a very controversial topic, because if you extend that logic, then you can say that colonialism was perfectly justified, because colonial powers, they had all physical power, intellectual superiority and everything. That is why they were able to colonize other society, and the colonized people, they were supposed to fade away, they were supposed to disappear, because they did not have the ability to withstand. Okay, and now we know that kind of a social Darwinism, or this whole idea that the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest, it's a highly problematic argument. It is least bothered about the powerless. It is least bothered about countries or individuals or people who are less powerful, and it really celebrates the more powerful section. So this whole section is about how Thomas Friedman's argument is nothing but a new form of social Darwinism. Okay, a new form of social Darwinism, where he is giving some kind of a justification for the brute competition. He is giving justification for the control of some important or powerful corporates over the others. So Friedman's flat world is a global electronic version of the classical liberal equations of the laissez-faire regimes of contracts with direct democracy, arguing that Globalization 3.0 empowers individuals as never before. Friedman updates Spencer's market-based individualism. So Spencer also has very elaborate discussions about how the state should not have any role in the market, and the market must be able to function on its own. A kind of a market-based individualism. Okay, you as an individual, you bargain with others, and then your bargaining ability, your economic position will give a kind of an equilibrium to the kind of market. So he's criticizing Thomas Friedman for simply following this particular argument. Affirming mass consumption, Friedman has a sunnier view than 19th century social Darwinists, who held that poverty is the best policy to discipline profligate workers. Okay, so Friedman shares the classical liberal view that capitalism's class hierarchy is the product of a meritocratic struggle that rewards individual achievements and punish free riders, and this is a legitimate, even pivotal facet of democracy. Okay, so this class hierarchy where you have some people are highly very rich and some people are very poor, this Friedman would argue that's perfectly legitimate. It's a product of a meritocratic struggle, because the people who are on the top of this hierarchy, they are the most meritocratic. Okay, the people who are really suffering at the bottom, they simply do not have any merit. And you know that this is a very dangerous argument. Okay, this is a very dangerous argument which we can see even employed in the contemporary Indian society. Okay, why that certain castes are underrepresented in some of the important occupations or professions. Many people would say that they are lazy, or they are not putting in hard work. Okay, or some upper castes are overrepresented in some of the important positions, and it would say that they are all meritocratic. They are all they have intelligence. But all these arguments really fail to understand the kind of a structural inequality. Okay, structural inequality that makes it so much difficult for the people from the lower strata to compete with others from the upper strata. And the structural inequality also makes it much more easier for the people from the upper sections to compete with others much more easily. So Friedman simply falls prey to that kind of an argument and doesn't understand or doesn't have the patience to look into the kind of a structural aspects of this inequality. His rhetorical celebration of the flat world does not address the grossly unequal opportunities faced by the poor Americans, especially minority children in underclass schools and others on the margin. So, inequality is not an area in which Friedman is interested in. But for him, it's a boring subject. Everything will be all right if you open up the market. But we know that it simply doesn't work that way. We know that poverty has its own mechanism of reproduction. Okay, people who are coming from the lowest section, especially a section where you have double disadvantage of being economically poor, and also if you are a minority, religious minority or ethnic minority, then you have, your difficulties compound. Okay, you are at a highly structurally disadvantageous position to compete with each other and then come up. So the whole idea of Friedman's idea of a perfectly flat world, okay, it's only a kind of a utopia. It simply doesn't exist anywhere. Okay, yeah. So Friedman declares that he's a journalist, not a salesman of globalization, and that he's keenly aware of globalization's downside. However, he does not engage globalization's non-corporate participants and essentially dismisses its critics. Equating neoliberalism and globalization, they hold that US-led global capitalism is a runaway locomotive that homogenizes everything in its path. Genuine cultures, community, and politics are flattened by untrammeled, deracinated individualism, economism, and consumerism. So Friedman has no, he's not critical of the side effects of neoliberalism. He's not sensitive to the kind of cultural violence on other communities. He's not concerned about the side effects of this, consumerism, increasing consumerism, the kind of ecological consequence, ecological degradation. He's not bothered about each of these things. He thinks that America is the model, and America will continue to remain the model for the rest of the world, because that's the most flat place in the world. Now, maybe sitting in 2020, it's time that you critically analyze Thomas Friedman's essay. Now, we know that America as a country is reeling under so much of trouble. Okay, so much of trouble with rising unemployment, with rising xenophobia, with rising violence against black communities. So America is no longer a model. Okay, America's unchallenged supremacy is seriously under threat. Okay, so there is a major anti-globalization movement happening in America. Okay, we know that the side effects of globalization has not influenced every sections of Americans uniformly. Okay, there are maybe sections in California, in Silicon Valley, who were enormously benefited from globalization. But vast majority of lower middle class and middle class Americans have not. They have to encounter, they have to face a lot of job loss and then unemployment and falling incomes and uncertainty, a host of issues. That is why many people have argued that a person like Donald Trump, who wanted to protect American economy from globalization, he wanted to build a wall between Mexico and America. He wanted to restrict migrant workers coming to America. All these arguments became more popular and accepted, and finally he became the president of the United States of America. So, but Friedman's arguments were extremely persuasive. They were very powerful. They were very popular. Okay, more than being persuasive, they were very popular, and they heavily influenced the imaginations of ordinary people, because he was able to combine the neoliberal economic logic with that of globalization, and then presented a very glorified, rosy picture to the rest of the population. And now we see that it was only a projection, it was only glorification, okay, which was completely, very, very different or distant from the actual reality. Okay, so let us stop here. So I would again urge you to read this whole essay. So just like today's class, we'll have more of such kind of sessions where I introduce you to this whole essay, and I will have this highlighted sections will be read out, so that you get a kind of idea about this whole essay. Okay, so thank you. We'll meet in the next class.